So when we look at the days of Noah sign that Jesus provides, and we link and overlay Luke's version on that, we get not only the days of Noah, but the days of Lot. Why? Because that's still within that generation of Noah, and there's a destruction of fire, which leads us from an apocalypse of water to an apocalypse of fire, reserved, according to 2 Peter 3, for the end time.
The signs of the times are all around us, and Jesus commanded us to watch and pray. Join me, Jennifer LeClaire, as we unpack the prophetic significance of current events, share the Holy Spirit's revelations for this hour, and offer strategies for walking in the Spirit and triumphing over spiritual warfare in the last days. Get equipped in this episode of the End Times Watchman.
Could it be possible that royal families, as we know them today, descended from the Nephilim? This is the contention of Gary Wayne, among other things. He, in this episode of the End Times Watchman, carries us through pre-flood and post-flood Nephilim and the dynasties of the earth today, and how he believes it traces back to hybrid giants. This is not a fairy tale, but it is quite difficult to wrap your mind around. You might have to watch it twice. Let's get right into it. Is it possible that there's Nephilim in the earth today, or is that going to be later on in the end times?
Yeah, that's one of the big speculative questions, because it's going to be like the days of Noah, right? And in the days of Noah, we have not only the godlessness leading up to the flood that we're going to be going into with the universal religion in preparation for Antichrist in the end time, but you're also going to have other things that are similar. So what might be similar? Well, we have violence before the flood, and we get some violence that's mentioned a little bit in the days of Noah in the New Testament as well. But this violence is caused by the giants. These are the ones who usurped the governments and the kingdoms and the dynasties, both before and after the flood. They were taught, this is extracurricular, outside the Bible. I was just struggling with that word. Outside the Bible, from the book of Enoch, that Azazel, the leader of the Watchers, likely Abaddon and Apollyon, because Azazel in the book of Enoch, as the leader of the Watchers, is sent to the pit prison, is likely the one who comes out of the pit prison in the end time in Revelation 9. He taught all the arts and crafts of war. That means not just making weapons, but how to fight, the tactics of war, strategy of war, and the technology that is said to be given to humankind and the giants in the time of Enoch in the book of Enoch and other sources as well. And that they took this level to a technology to a level that angels are very powerful beings, and they would have had the technology to destroy the world by fire, which is a reference I made a few minutes ago, that the flood comes about. And I think that technology reached a level that we're just catching up to this day, and God intercedes and permits the flood to come, or commands the flood to come, or uses the fallen angels to bring the flood. However that happens, it happens because it's God's permitting it to happen, to be an intercession, so that all the names in the book of life that are written in that book from before creation will have an opportunity to leave their name in that book or have it blotted out. So there's a set agenda that God is trying to create more people to be in his kingdom for eternity. And so to prevent this war destroying the world by fire, he brings the flood. And that's why fire is reserved for the end time, because that's a final sort of destruction. And so that's part of the technology. And then the second thing is the whole earth was corrupted. And not just the whole earth, but all the flesh was corrupted. It's the Hebrew word shakath, and it means to pervert, to ruin, to decay, to destroy, those types of things. So that's all of the DNA, and that's all of the plant genomes. This is the technology we're just catching up to this day from another level. So the words that are used in the Hebrew are telling us to look deeper into what happened. So We're doing DNA manipulation that they call chimera projects. Well, that's an antediluvian term for DNA manipulation to create all sorts of creatures in polytheism. So we need to understand that. And again, these you could go into a very deep sort of um, dissertations on these things. I just want to sort of give a snapshot as to these giants, and could they be here to this day, which was the question. So I want to get back to that, but I want to understand people understand the importance of this. So if it's going to be like the days of Noah, you can deduce that either giants somehow were spared in the earth, off the earth, in another dimension, somehow by fallen angels. Somehow giants show up after the flood. So, and I'm not saying that that's what happened. I'm just saying you could speculate that, because if it's going to be like the days of Noah, somehow giants have to show up. So if they're going to show up, it's going to be either like that, or it's going to be another creation of giants, because the angels not in the pit prison who rebelled know their time is short from their pronouncement in the time of First Peter 3 when Jesus was in the grave, and that they're going to recreate giants. That's a possibility. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but we have to sort of recognize that that could be a possibility. And so there's one other thing that we need to keep in mind is that these giants, both before the flood and after the flood, had offspring. And so from a and I tend to look at giants surviving the flood more from a second incursion. So another creation of giants after the flood versus survival. I'm open to survival, but I would say the Bible lines up better with a second incursion. Now, here's how people get there in terms of survival is that in the flood story, again, it says God was going to destroy everything he created except for the eight and the animals that are pure without DNA manipulation on the ark, right? Well, he didn't create the giants. The fallen angels did, and put a counterfeit spirit or a demonic spirit or an evil spirit or an unclean spirit, as we would understand that, into them, which was an immortal spirit. And it doesn't sleep when they go when they die. It's not allowed into heaven. They're only going to go to three different places. They're going to either make it to their heaven, which isn't where God is. It's where the fallen angels reside in Hades, or Sheol, as it's called in the Old and New Testament. They're going to be wandering the earth, like as in dry places, as Jesus describes these unclean spirits, devils, and evil spirits. And that word devil should probably be translated in the KJV as demons, because the Greek word is daemon versus diablos, that it is used for devil for Satan specifically. So these are the demonic disembodied spirits. And the other place that they would go is if they're part of the terrible ones, as they're called in the KJV, and specifically Ezekiel 32, other passages, but that's the important chapter. They're in the sides of the pit prison, along with the strong ones, which are El in Hebrew there. So the fallen angels, and the terrible ones, which are the mighty ones, are Gibor, Gibborim, just as giants are described as Gibborim, mighty ones in Genesis 6:4. So I know that's a long sort of a dissertation in terms of why they could, how they're going to show up after the flood. And I think it's a second incursion because it fits better with the offspring gods versus the parent gods. To understand prehistory, understand that there's two groups of gods. One rules before, one's after. So the easiest way to understand it from a biblical perspective is using the Canaanite pantheon, which is El and Ashtaroth, which are parent gods, which are overthrown by Baal, Anat, and the rest of the Baalim after the flood and rule after the flood. So, and in those accounts and all polytheist accounts, they kill the parent gods. Well, you can't kill an immortal being. Only God can do that. They're in the pit prison. But in the Ugaritic text, what's interesting is that the Baalim, and Baal and Anat in particular, but also Amaru and other gods of the Baalim Council, created Rephaim giants after the flood. So you get a second incursion in that account, and you get second incursion accounts in polytheist versions. But I wanted to be able to use an account in book 2 to show how we have a Semitic language that we can cross-reference directly into the original Hebrew and get the exact same words, because originally Hebrew was vowelless, same as original Semitic. So you can take it right back to Nephilim, for example, which would be NPL, and or Raphaim, which would be RPM, and that's how it would show up in ancient Semitic and ancient Hebrew. So you can make those direct links with that. So after the flood, which is my preferred position of being recreated, they set up all of the dynasties again after the flood. The thing that's different with the giants after the flood is they're not as large, and they have a fertility issue, and they don't have as many gifts that were passed on. So there's some restrictions seemingly that have come into play to give a little bit longer period of time for all things to come back through the cycle through the beast empires, which are going to be bloodlines of the giants that are the emperors and the kings there. And so they have a fertility issue that shows up, whereas the Nephilim produced in great numbers before the flood, had no reason to be recreating smaller giants with humans, because they were there to wipe humankind from the face of the earth. They're the ones that were created so the fallen angels wouldn't have blood on their hands. So they're the ones who blaspheme God. Fallen angels don't do that. Angels don't do that. They know the power of the God Most High, but they use their spurious offspring and their followers to do that. And that's what we see in the religions that they created with the mystical religions to honor the pantheon of the gods all around the world. And that pantheon is the same pantheon, just different vernacular names. So you have, let's say, using a post-Diluvian pantheon, you have El at the top of the Canaanite, Osiris would be the same, Zeus would be the same, Anki on Enlil would be the same. Before the flood, you would have Kronos in Greek, you would have Ra in Egypt, you have El in Canaan, you would have Anu in Sumeria, to use those four pantheons. So just different vernacular names all around the world. So when we start to look at these dynasties, they are going to go extinct and lose control unless they start to intermarry with human women, because they have, and females with human men, because they have this inability to produce females as it sort of shows up. Now, what's interesting is we see a biblical example of this, actually two vivid ones, and then one downstream in the time of David. But I'll just get to Genesis 36, because that is an addition to the table of nations to help us make some sense of this. So you have a group of people in Genesis 36 called the Dukes of Edom, and one are the descendants of Esau, brother of Jacob. The other one are Horim giants, which are described in Deuteronomy 2, like the Emim, like the Anakim, like the Avim, like the Casluhim, are giants. And that's Hebrew Raphaim versus Nephilim, which are antediluvian giants. So these are giants, and Seir is the leader of it. And Seir, it's kind of either strange coincidence, but it's rooted in a word that comes out of satyr or satyr for a goat god. It's a direct derivative of it, just as Nephilim is a derivative of Nephal, to fall, or Nephilim is the fallen ones. And it carries part of the meaning, but not all of the meaning, right? So there's a distinction with the giants as being the offspring in that case. And he has a daughter named Timnah, purebred, matriarchal offspring, who marries Eliphaz, son of Esau, to create Amalekites, which is not a pureblood giant race, but what we call a hybrid human giant race. And what you would read about in, let's say, the Egyptian execration text called the Shazu. They're about 6 to 9 feet tall versus 10 to 16 feet tall for the most of the giants recorded after the flood, at least biblically. And 19 feet would be Gilgamesh, which was also in the Ugaritic text and Sumerian text, but that's outside the Bible and seems to be a different kind of giant because it's a dark-haired giant versus the red hair and the blonde-haired giants. So when we look at this marriage, they're starting a tribe that is going to be waiting in ambush for Israel to come out of Egypt to wipe them from the face of the earth. Why? Because Jacob stole the blessings and the birthright and the Messianic promise from Esau. So now you would have a dragon bloodline of on the inheriting all of the things that Jacob inherited if they were to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. Now, Esau also marries Oholibama, which is also a Horim giant, and starts another one, which might be the hybrid Horites that are recorded in the Edomite area as well. Now, the Amalekim giants actually show up in Genesis 14 well before, generations before, the Amalekites, who take the name after the Amalekim giants, and then they're going to move to Petra and live amongst the Amalekim giants afterwards. So that's kind of how the name has arrived. And they've created with this pure blood fairy queen a new dynasty and a new people. And the word Duke is Aleph, where they get elf from as a transliteration. And the Catholic encyclopedia records describe these bloodlines and hybrids as Alephim, as a separate sort of distinct kind of breed. And this very matriarchal new dynasty bloodline is where the blood type is passed on and the genes are passed on according to polytheist beliefs. So you see that through the fairy tales, the fairy queens and the dragon kings like Uther Pendragon and Guinevere, who's they're both Tuatha De Danann giant descendants. She's the fairy queen, he's the dragon king, son of Uther Pendragon, of course, as they write it. But that's another rabbit hole to go down. So we get these hybrid giants that are going to be eventually going to take over from the purebreds because they have to continue to use humans to intermarry because they're going to go to extinct and they're going to get fewer and fewer as a pureblood, and they're going to develop blood diseases that we see the royales with to this day. And understand that that word royale goes back to Old French for roy, king, back to reg and regalis in Latin, into Indo-Aryan, which is the language of the giants, to the Indo-Aryan. You might see PIE, that's Proto-Indo-European. That's the same thing as Indo-Aryan, to the word reg, which is for ruler. So Rex, not Rex, but Roy and Al. Al is a transliteration in the Middle East of El, just as Baal means Lord God, right? Or Master God, and a couple other things, but it's the Al that's important here. And so these are the kings of God by their title. And they received their divine right to rule from the Baalim Council. And they've done this both before the flood and after the flood. And the Baalim Council is located at Mount Saphon, which is Mount Hermon as we know it, generally speaking, although it's also known as Shinir and Sion and Sirion. Sion is a different word than Zion, but it is used almost, unfortunately, interchangeably at times. But they're two different words in two different locations and two different meanings. So Mount Sion is the home of the Baalim Council. And so yeah, it starts to really get interesting as you start to understand some of these things. And that's where Bashan is located. And it's also the place where Jesus went to establish his church with his announcement. And he is telling them that their time is over and I'm going to establish my church on this rock, himself, the mountain, and Peter, who has the name changed to Rock or Peter from Simon, that this church is going to be built on. And this is the location that we talked about, that it looks like from when you look at um, Psalm 68, they go to Bashan and the mountain there that they're being paraded out to and shown to the current ruling Baalim council that, hey, they're going to the lake of fire and so are you. So anyways,
Wow.
just to finish, and I'll just finish on this, is that
Yeah.
it's these descendants in the royal bloodlines that are still here to this day, who are the part of the visible hierarchy doing the beckoning of the council of the gods. So we do get in the end time in the book of Revelation, the great and mighty men that you're getting in several chapters like Revelation 18, like Revelation 6 and 19. And they go back to two words, Meg and Megastranes, which in Greek are like a very large, giant type of man.
Wow. See, that's incredible. This is, my mind is all over the place. Now I'm thinking about, so now we're talking about that there's bloodlines still active today in the ruling elite. Uh,
Yeah,
but most people would never think that, would never know that. This is woven into our society even today. It started, eh, prehistory. So this has always been at
it
some
has
level. This is
been.
always, yeah.
And here's what really should get people thinking is, I used to ask the question when I went on shows is what makes a royale? Who gave them the right to rule? Everybody says, well, they're ruling at the behest of God. Are you sure about that? Because they keep their genealogies right back into prehistory. And those genealogies go back to a patriarchal, for the most part, a patriarchal giant, a Nephilim or a Rephaim, and sometimes both in their belief system, and back to one of the celestial mafia godfathers, one of the fallen angels. And the purity or the ennobling of that bloodline by grafting in as a scion, as SCION as they transliterate it, um, that's where you're going to fit within the hierarchy in terms of the purity or the ennobleness, and both in terms of where you're going to be fitting. So King Charles, he knows his genealogy right back to the beginning of time, and we saw him publicly do a ritual that went back to the time of the flood, and is likely the same ritual that was done before the flood or something similar, where they received their divine right to rule and swore their oath to a specific god. Now, we're told it's the God of the Bible, but it's the God of their genealogy, and that we're told not to swear oaths.
Throughout Scripture, God gives us end times revelation. And Jesus told us to watch and pray in relation to the end times over and over again. But how do you practically do this? What does watching and praying in the last days look like? God is raising up end times watchmen all over the world. Many are having dreams, visions, receiving prophetic words about the last of the last days. If the Holy Spirit is stirring your heart about the end times, this book is for you. In this timely book, you'll discover how to discern your calling as an end times watchman, walk in an end times lifestyle and anointing, prepare a generation for the Lord's return, navigate eschatological views and apocalyptic dreams and visions, practically watch for the true signs of the times, deliver end times warnings with wisdom, pray in agreement with God's end times plans, intercede from an eternal perspective, stand in your end times assignment, and so much more. Pick up your copy of the End Times Watchman, the prophetic intercessor's guide to watching and praying through the last days, on Amazon or jenniferleclaire.org/End Times Watchman.
People, they do sexual experiments on them, they need their DNA, same sort of mythos as the Greys, and they're described identically to the Greys. So now we're starting to get groups of beings that are part of the elementals in several areas that would be equated with the aliens.
The whole world is in crisis, and the signs of the times are accelerating. We're in a hinge moment in history, and the enemy knows his time is short. But in 2007, God woke me up after midnight and spoke to my heart about a third great awakening. Now, we're closer than we've ever been before. That's why I'm calling 1 million revival-minded intercessors to join me in making a new appeal to heaven. I'm calling remnant prayer warriors to gather in one accord to push back the darkness that's invading our churches, our families, and our nations. The enemy is raging. The great falling away is underway, but God always responds to united prayer and fasting. Join me and intercessors in over 100 nations at Awakening Prayer Hubs. Together, we can change the course of history. AwakeningPrayerHubs.com. Join the movement.
At Jennifer LeClaire Ministries, our heart is to sow into the lives of people who may never otherwise hear the gospel of Christ or break out of bondage. Although we've traveled to dozens of nations in strategic missions to evangelize and equip believers, there's more work to do than we can possibly get done by ourselves. That's why JLM is partnering with ministries around the world to help them do what they do best. We're partnering with ministries in India that are transforming the lives of people with leprosy. Ministries in Africa that are bringing clean water to the masses. Global ministries taking the hope of the gospel to the ends of the earth. Messiah-centered ministries in Israel that are doing the work of Christ in the Middle East. Ministries that provide a hand of hope to hurting people in America's inner cities and the nations. When you sow into JLM, you are sowing into the work of God in the nations. Together, we're better. Will you partner with us to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, to feed hungry people, to bring hope to the addicted, and more? You can sow a seed today at jenniferleclaire.org/donate. Thank you for your partnership.
This program has been made by the friends and partners of Jennifer LeClaire Ministries. We hope you enjoyed today's teaching.
For more information, visit jenniferleclaire.org.